And in a courtroom on Long Island, New York, Rex Heuermann received 3 life sentences today for choking and dismembering 8 women, most of them in his basement, over the course of more than 15 years. The 62-year-old serial killer addressed the court before he was sent away. Our Tom Hansen.
In a packed courtroom, Rex Heuermann, the architect turned notorious serial killer, listened as his victims' families called him a monster and evil. Then Heuermann himself addressed the court.
There are no words I can say. I am responsible for what was said in this room today.
Those words ended a case that had haunted Long Island for more than 3 decades. But to understand how we got to that courtroom, 8 women disappeared from Long Island over 17 years. For most of that time, police didn't even realize the cases were connected. Women vanished one by one after meeting clients. Years passed. Bodies kept turning up. But there was no suspect, no witnesses, no confession. It took more than a decade to identify the killer. And in the end, the break came from something most people throw away without thinking: a pizza crust. Before we get into how a pizza crust helped solve one of America's longest-running serial murder investigations, we tell true crime stories with the facts first and the victims never forgotten. If that's the kind of content you enjoy, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next case. And if you've been with the channel for a while, thank you for coming back and for all your support. It really means a lot. Now, let's go back to where this story really began. Long before anyone called this a serial killer's work, it was just a string of missing women nobody had connected yet. Between 2007 and 2010, 4 women vanished from the New York area, months or sometimes years apart. Maureen Brainerd Barnes was 25, a single mother of 2 living in Norwich, Connecticut, when she disappeared in July 2007. She'd called her sister, Missy Can, from Penn Station that night, saying she'd catch a train home. She never did. Years later, D.A. Ray Tierney would describe her as someone who fiercely protected the people she loved. Melissa Barthelemy, 24, from the Bronx, vanished 2 years later, in July 2009. Megan Waterman, 22, a mother to a 3-year-old daughter back home in Scarborough, Maine, disappeared from a motel in June 2010 after telling her pimp she was stepping out to a convenience store. Amber Lynn Costello, 27, was the last of the 4, gone by September that same year. The only one of the 4 last seen on Long Island itself, in North Babylon. All 4 had advertised online and worked as sex workers, meeting clients who found them through the same escort listings. Each of them left to meet someone and never came home. At the time, none of these disappearances were treated as connected. They sat as open missing persons files in different towns, going nowhere, because nobody yet had a reason to look at them side by side. In the weeks after Melissa Barthelemy disappeared, her 15-year-old sister started getting phone calls from Melissa's own cell number. The calls came from busy Manhattan sidewalks, never lasted more than a few minutes, and only ever came to her and never to their mother. The man on the line described what he'd done to Melissa and made clear she wasn't coming back. Investigators later traced 5 of these calls, made between mid-July and late August 2009, to blocks in Midtown Manhattan, the same blocks where Rex Heuermann's office sat, though nobody knew his name yet. In May 2010, a 24-year-old woman named Shanann Gilbert ran screaming from a client's house in the beachside community of Oak Beach and called 911. The call lasted over 20 minutes. By the time anyone reached her, she was gone. Gilbert's disappearance isn't part of this story the way it might seem. Her death was later ruled an accidental drowning, and nothing has ever tied it to the man eventually arrested for the other murders. But it was the search for her that December that sent police into the marshy brush along Ocean Parkway, and that's where everything changed. In December 2010, searchers found a body wrapped in burlap in the undergrowth off Ocean Parkway. Then another, then 2 more. The 4 bodies belonged to Barthelemy, Waterman, Costello, and Brainerd Barnes, the same 4 women who'd vanished, one at a time, over the previous 3 years. Investigators started calling them the Gilgo 4. Suffolk County's district attorney at the time said plainly that he believed all four had been murdered by the same person, their causes of death substantially similar. The department's chief of detectives later pointed out how alike the women looked physically, small in height, small in frame, all in their 20s. Whoever did this had a type, and everyone working the case knew it from the start. Over the following months, more remains turned up along the same stretch of coastline until the count reached 10. Some belonged to women who'd gone missing just as recently as the Gilgo Four. Others, it would eventually turn out, belonged to women who disappeared years before anyone had ever heard of Gilgo Beach, cases nobody had thought to connect because nobody yet knew there was anything connecting them. By early 2011, investigators had 10 sets of remains, a stretch of coastline with a body count rising every few months, and almost nothing else. They had a pattern. They didn't have a name. It would take them 12 more years to get one. The reason this case sat unsolved for over a decade isn't a mystery. Investigators have said so themselves, on the record, years later. Because the victims were sex workers, their disappearances didn't get the same urgency a different kind of victim might have gotten. The police commissioner at the time would later admit there were things investigators could have done better. DA Ray Tierney was blunter about the department's early handling of the case, describing officers who'd walk the beach looking for clues without any real plan behind it. So the case didn't stall because the evidence wasn't there. It stalled because, for a long time, almost nobody was looking hard enough to find it. As investigators kept working through the 10 sets of remains found near Gilgo Beach, some of them turned out to be a lot older than the case itself. 3 of the women, Karen Vergata, Valerie Mack, and Jessica Taylor, had gone missing years before anyone had ever heard the name Gilgo Beach. Vergata disappeared in 1996. Parts of her remains were found that same year on Fire Island, and more turned up near Gilgo Beach in 2011, but nobody could say who she was. She stayed a Jane Doe for over 25 years. Mack disappeared around 2000, and parts of her were found in Manorville that year, then more at Gilgo Beach in 2011. The same story, another unidentified woman with no name attached to her file. Taylor's case was different in one respect. She was found fast, but not found whole. She was 20, from Poughkeepsie, working as an escort near Heuermann's own Midtown office when she disappeared in July 2003. Her mother realized something was wrong when Jessica didn't call for her own birthday. Days later, part of Taylor's dismembered body turned up in Manorville. It would take almost 8 more years for the rest of her skull, her hands, her forearm, to surface at Gilgo Beach, nearly a mile from where the other 4 had been found. Her mother would later say it was a tragedy her daughter never had children of her own. Jessica had spent her time working with kids at a summer camp and would have made a great mother. Sandra Castilla's case went differently. 2 hunters found her body in Southampton in November 1993, and police had a name for her within days. Her fingerprints were already on file from an earlier arrest. So Castilla was never a mystery in that sense. What took 30 years wasn't figuring out who she was. It was figuring out that her murder and the others belonged to the same man. 4 women. 4 separate discoveries, years apart, most of them with no name attached for a decade or more. And still, nobody had connected any of it to what happened at Gilgo Beach. Through the 2010s, the case went quiet. No arrest, no suspect, no public update worth reporting. For the families, that silence meant something specific. Years of not knowing, with no indication that anyone was still looking. The Gilgo Beach murders became the kind of case people brought up as an example of an investigation gone cold. Not solved, not forgotten exactly, just stuck. But the families themselves never fully stopped pushing. More than a decade after the bodies were found, Maureen Brainerd Barnes's sister, Missy Cann, was still speaking to reporters, still asking publicly for someone to solve it. "My sister deserves to see justice," she said. She'd believed, for years, that Maureen had simply been job hunting the week she vanished, not that she'd never see her again. Whatever pressure eventually built toward reopening the case, families like the Cans had been applying it the entire time, long before anyone in an official capacity picked it back up. That's where things stayed until January 2022, when a new police commissioner and a new district attorney decided to take one more look at everything the case had ever produced. In January 2022, Suffolk County stood up a new task force to take one more look at Gilgo Beach. This time it wasn't just local police. The DA's office, the Suffolk County Police Department, the New York State Police, the Sheriff's Office, and the FBI all sat at the same table, working the same file. They didn't have new evidence yet. What they had was a decision to actually look. One of the first things the task force did was go back through everything witnesses had said years earlier and see what had been overlooked. Buried in an old file was a description from the night Amber Costello disappeared in 2010. A witness had seen a distinctive green Chevrolet Avalanche pickup truck near her home. Nobody had followed that thread all the way through. The task force did. The registration led them to a Massapequa Park architect named Rex Heuermann. From there, investigators started building a quieter case. Heuermann had used burner phones for years, but burner phones still connect to cell towers, and cell towers keep records. The pattern wasn't limited to one victim. In the days before Brainerd Barnes disappeared in 2007, her phone had exchanged 16 separate calls and texts with a single burner number, the same method later used on Barthélemy, years apart, on the other side of the case entirely. When investigators lined up all of it against Heuermann's known movements, the pattern matched. He'd been in the right places, at the right times, again and again, going back over a decade. It wasn't proof yet, but it was enough to put him at the center of the investigation. In January 2023, investigators watched Heuermann outside his office in Manhattan. He ordered pizza, ate it, and threw the crust away in a public trash can. That was enough. Investigators recovered the crust and ran the DNA. It matched a male hair found on the burlap wrapped around Megan Waterman's remains, the same burlap that had sat unidentified in an evidence room for over a decade. On July 13, 2023, Rex Heuermann was arrested outside his Manhattan office. He was charged with 3 counts of murder: Melissa Barthélemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Costello, and named the prime suspect in a 4th, Maureen Brainerd Barnes. He was 59 years old. An architect, a husband, a father, no criminal record of any kind. For 13 years, he had lived a normal life less than 6 miles from where the bodies were found. Hours after the arrest, Melissa Barthélemy's mother spoke to reporters. She'd known all along, she said, that the taunting phone calls to her daughter, the ones that had haunted the family for 14 years, were going to be the thing that finally caught him. Within days of the arrest, investigators searched Heuermann's home in Massapequa Park. They dug up the backyard, they searched a storage unit he kept nearby. Inside, they found more than 200 guns and a collection of hard drives. 6 days after the arrest, Heuermann's wife of 27 years, Asa Ellerup, filed for divorce. The police commissioner said Ellerup and her daughter were shocked, disgusted, and embarrassed when they learned the charges, and that he didn't believe they'd known about the double life Heuermann had been living. Investigators found no evidence tying Ellerup or the couple's children to any of the murders. Court records showed she and the kids had been out of town each time a killing took place. The evidence tied him to the murders in ways that went beyond digital records. Brainerd Barnes's remains had been found bound with a belt, and that belt, prosecutors said, carried the initials of Heuermann's own father. Hair recovered from the buckle would later help connect the case directly to him. Separately, records found in his storage unit showed his wife and children had been traveling out of town at the time of each murder, the same pattern repeating across every victim, going back years, whether investigators were looking for it yet or not. On one of those hard drives, prosecutors say they found something investigators hadn't expected: a document kept for years that laid out in detail how to select a victim, how to kill her, and how to get rid of the body afterward. DA Ray Tierney later described it in court as something Heuermann had used to methodically blueprint his own murders. It wasn't a confession, but it read like a man who had planned to do this again. Through 2024, the case kept expanding. In January, prosecutors added a charge for Maureen Brainerd Barnes, closing out all 4 of the original Gilgo 4. In June, 2 more charges followed, Sandra Castilla and Jessica Taylor. In December, a 7th, Valerie Mack. The Castilla charge mattered for a reason beyond the number. For 30 years, investigators had suspected a different man, John Bittrolf, a Manorville carpenter, already serving 50 years to life for 2 separate murders with strikingly similar crime scenes. Bittrolf was never charged in Castilla's death, but he'd stayed the presumed suspect for decades. When new DNA testing was run on a male hair recovered from Castilla's body, it excluded 99.96% of the North American population, and it excluded Bittrolf. It did not exclude Heuermann. In an odd twist, it was Bittrolf himself who had pushed for the testing, hoping it would point investigators toward Heuermann instead of him. It did exactly that. Heuermann's defense has since challenged the strength of that evidence, calling it no more than a single hair on a shirt. The charge stands regardless, but the dispute over it isn't fully settled. None of this came together quickly or easily. By the time prosecutors had enough to bring the full case before a grand jury, investigators had relied on some 300 subpoenas, search warrants, and other legal filings just to gather the evidence. By September 2025, a judge ruled that all 7 murder cases would be tried together in a single proceeding. Prosecutors began preparing for what was expected to be one of the largest homicide trials in Long Island's history. Over 100 witnesses, 3 decades of evidence, 7 separate murders under one roof. The trial was set for September 2026. It never got there. For nearly 3 years, Heuermann denied everything. His lawyer told reporters they'd fight the case at trial. Then, on April 8, 2026, 2 months before that trial was set to begin, he changed his plea. In a Suffolk County courtroom, Heuermann pleaded guilty to 7 counts of murder. For Taylor specifically, he admitted, in his own words on the record, to strangling her in July 2003, then dismembering her body and transporting the remains to 2 separate locations, Manorville and Gilgo Beach, which is exactly why it took investigators 8 years to find all of her. And then he went further than anyone expected, he admitted on the record, to an 8th killing he'd never even been charged with. Karen Vergata, the woman found in pieces on Fire Island in 1996, identified by name only 3 years earlier. There would be no trial, no 100 witnesses. Just a guilty man standing in a courtroom, finally saying it out loud. Outside the courthouse afterward, Missy Cann talked about a promise she'd made to her sister back in 2010, the day Maureen's body was identified. Through every year since, every setback, every unanswered question, she said she'd carried Maureen with her. And she'd kept that promise. On June 17, 2026, Heuermann returned to court to be sentenced. Judge Timothy Mazzei handed down the maximum the law allowed, 3 consecutive terms of life without parole, plus 4 more consecutive terms of 25 years to life. Whichever way the math worked out, Heuermann would die in prison. Before the sentence came down, 10 to 15 family members spoke. Megan Waterman's daughter, who was 3 years old the day her mother was reported missing, told the court the damage went far beyond the day the crime happened. Jessica Taylor's cousin looked at Heuermann directly and told him he'd chosen small women because he was nothing more than a coward. DA Ray Tierney called him a remorseless, sadistic killer who only cared about himself. The current police commissioner said the calm, grandfatherly image Heuermann had worn through 2.5 years of court appearances had been a lie. That day, everyone finally saw him for what he was, a sadistic, soulless, murderous monster. Then Judge Mazzei addressed Heuermann directly. He asked whether Heuermann was at least a little sorry for the 8 women he'd strangled to death. Heuermann answered, "Yes, I am." The judge didn't seem to believe him. Heuermann had been described as a big man, Maze said, but in that courtroom he was nothing more than a disgusting, despicable small man, a coward. Then he ordered the court officers to get him out of the room. The families broke into applause as he was led away. Even after the sentencing, two questions from this case remain open. Shannon Gilbert is still, officially, not one of Heuermann's victims. Her death is still ruled an accidental drowning. It was the search for her that led police into those woods in the first place. But her family has spent 16 years disputing that ruling, and nothing about this case has changed it either way. When Heuermann was arrested, Shannan's sister had a strong reaction of her own, even though, officially, nothing about Shannan's own case has moved since. There's also John Bitrolf, the man who spent 30 years as the presumed suspect in Sandra Costilla's murder before DNA pointed to Heuermann instead. Bitrolf is still serving his own 50 years to life sentence for two separate killings, and his lawyers are now asking the courts to take a second look at his convictions too, arguing the similarities between his crime scenes and Heuermann's go deeper than coincidence. That question hasn't been settled either. And there's still a woman investigators call Asian Doe, found in that same stretch of coastline, still unidentified. DA Ray Tierney has said plainly that he won't speculate about whether Heuermann killed her too, not without evidence he could actually bring in front of a grand jury. So for now, she stays exactly what she's been since 2011, a woman with no name in a case that's officially closed. 8 women got a name attached to their killer. 1 got named but not connected. 1 still has no name at all. It took 12 years to identify the man responsible for what happened at Gilgo Beach. It took a task force willing to reopen a file nobody else wanted to touch, a truck description nobody had followed up on, and, in the end, a piece of garbage nobody thought twice about throwing away. Rex Heuermann will die in prison. For the families who waited decades for that sentence, it's an ending. For the rest of Long Island's coastline, it isn't quite one yet. Before we wrap up, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to follow our future updates.